So have we got any questions for our illustrious panel and or general discussion points? Somebody.
Well, it's a stupid question until somebody asks it. Come on.
So most of you guys have been in here with us. You guys want to just quickly introduce yourselves? To the ones that were here earlier.
I'm John LeBlanc from Performance Designs.
Albert Berchtold. I manage the marketing department at Performance Designs. Been there for about 13 or 14 years now, a little bit less than John here. He's been around since the beginning, so happy to be here this weekend. I've met a lot of you last year at this event, so happy to be back again and see a lot of familiar faces.
And you got John and myself. So you have canopy manufacturer and then two of the container manufacturers as well. So it's open for questions that you may have.
Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Olaf. I'm Australian military parachute rigger, APF rigger, and North American Airborne Systems rigger examiner, and I'm UAE Special Forces rig examiner now. So questions to PD guys about Horizon. So life of the Horizon canopy and use for normal free fall. We have on the website it says that it's not designed for normal deployment, so it's only wingsuit canopy. And we have instances people jumping it and taking to terminal deployments. And obviously a general tendency with the parachutes now is downsizing. Everyone downsizing regardless of their experience, regardless of their discipline. And we've seen lots of my Horizon is 190 because I've followed what your website says for the loading for my weight. And I can see the guys 20 kilos heavier than me jumping 150s, Horizon 150s. So, and I suggested that it will shorten the life of the canopy significantly, where we cannot really find information. It would be good to have some kind of release regarding Horizon into wingsuiting community. Another thing is, that's what we found recently, is double stows through the grommets on the locking stows on the deployment bags. As some military guys know, in every military OS, if it goes through the grommet, it's a single. Everything else you can wrap it up. If your elastic's too long, you do double. But everything goes through the grommet, it was single. Latest tendency, apparently, we can double everything even for the grommet. So, and we have military riggers who jump actively as a civilian, and they start using that technique in the military, and we're having trouble with our high commanding officers because everything is uniform. It has to be uniformity in packing procedures. So it would be good to have some additional release on that, on the elastic. I think at this stage is all. Yeah, the question to you guys about free stows in the free bags. Obviously, we're trying to follow whatever manufacturer specifications you come with elastics for free stows. Sometimes it's hard to find specifications, so we have to buy from you. But it's sometimes it's difficult, especially even for civilian riggers as well, to actually get specs on materials used for repair and maintenance. That's it. Thank you.
So 3 questions.
Yeah.
So there's a couple questions there, and one was, I'll start with the Horizon request there for some information, and I'll break that into 2 parts. And one was information about the longevity of the canopy, and the other one that I kind of see there is the desire to use that for traditional free fall skydiving without a wingsuit. So there are some areas where they're somewhat related and some areas where they're completely separate. The majority of the testing and development that was done for the Horizon was based on the idea that canopy was to be used for wingsuit skydiving. We developed it primarily for that use in wingsuiting. So the type of deployment that you would typically see out of a wingsuit, not necessarily out of a solo person in free fall. Does that mean it won't work with a terminal deployment with someone in free fall? No, that's not the case at all. But if you increase to a free fall deployment speed, is that deployment likely to going to be a little bit quicker? Yes, it would be. Will it be quicker than what some people might be comfortable with? Quite possibly, because it's designed for that extremely slow speed deployment. That doesn't mean it can't be used occasionally for that. The general rule of thumb we give people is, yes, you can take it on a free fall deployment, but if you're primarily doing wingsuiting and 95% of your jumps are wingsuiting, and you decide to go do a free fall jump at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to change your canopy. Just you can leave your Horizon in there, go do it. But if your desire is to do maybe half of your jumps in a wingsuit and half of your jumps for free fall purposes, regular free fall jumps, then maybe that's not the right choice of canopy for you. Unless your intention is to change canopies. You do your wingsuit jumps with your Horizon, then you switch out and you do your free fall jumps with whatever your other free fall canopy is. Or if you're doing a 50-50 split, say, you may find that, and you're not jumping a gigantic suit, you may find that, a Spectre or a Storm or a Pulse or something like that is a better choice of wing if you're going to try and do a mix of jumps. And you're willing to say, okay, maybe this isn't the best wingsuit canopy. Maybe it's not as specifically made for wingsuiting as a Horizon is, but it still gets the job done very well, and it gives me that added flexibility to be able to do those free fall jumps. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
When it comes into longevity, basically what we tell people is it typically will have a shorter lifespan. You'll most likely see a shorter lifespan out of that type of wing than you would out of a traditional zero porosity canopy. Now, a lot of the folks here may have been around when old style F111 canopies were around, and that's what people jumped regularly, and it was somewhat expected then that a canopy's performance would begin to deteriorate over the course of its life, and you would start to notice, deployments changing. You would start to notice the way the canopy flies starts to get a little bit different. You'd start to notice the landing performance starts to deteriorate as well. And no one was jumping those canopies at 2.0 wing loadings back then. They were what people today would consider extremely light wing loadings on those F111 style canopies. But that was understood and that was known, that performance would begin to deteriorate. Even at a 1.0 or 1.1 wing loading, they would start to notice that their 210 square foot parachute just wasn't cutting the butter anymore. As the sport has evolved and we've gone to zero porosity materials, that's kind of been forgotten somewhat, especially in the newer generation, where they don't anticipate or they don't expect the performance of their canopy to deteriorate near as drastically or anywhere near as quickly. So when their canopy's got 700 or 800 jumps, there's somewhat of an expectation that it'll still perform the way it did when it had 5 jumps. Now, 20 years ago with an F111 wing, that wouldn't have been an expectation, but it is today. So with the Horizon, that's been somewhat of a re-education point for us to try and help people understand that lower porosity fabrics don't last. They're not going to maintain their porosity the way that a zero porosity canopy will. And they're going to start seeing that performance drop off over time. Now, how quickly will that occur? And when is the canopy worn out? That's going to vary greatly depending on where you jump, how you jump, what wing loading you choose to jump at, and what do you consider acceptable on the performance realm of that canopy, and your skill level as well. So somebody who has a very high experience level, they might own a Horizon and they jump it at they have one at a 1.6 wing loading, which is very high for our recommendations, and they jump it and they've got 1,000 jumps on it, and they're like, this thing's great, still flies like it was when it was brand new, but they might be landing it on rear risers because they're one of the best canopy pilots in the world, and they don't even need the toggles to land it. They're running out the landings on rear risers. So based on their skill level, they may be able to salvage what looks like an extremely awesome landing out of that canopy when it's well beyond what most other people in the skydiving community would be acceptable for them. So if you were to take that same canopy, let's say a Horizon 150 and it's got 1,000 jumps on it, and they jump in the desert in Dubai, and it might be completely worn out, but they're still landing on rear risers and it still looks awesome. They still make it look awesome. They take that same canopy and they give it to a newer wingsuiter who's got 300 skydives, and he just starts duffing in with it one time after the next because he doesn't have this, the performance of that wing has deteriorated to a certain point, and his skill level does not have what's necessary in order to compensate for that loss in performance. So putting an exact number on it, it's kind of like it's a moving target because it's going to be a little different for everybody, and the way people jump them is also going to vary, and their skill level. So jumping in, that's one of the reasons we put that limitation on there. We've said what are most people going to be capable of, and where are most people going to find reasonable performance with that canopy to a certain point in the future. And I believe what we used was around a 1.4, if my memory serves me correctly. And can you jump them slightly above that? Sure you can, but are you going to start to notice that performance deterioration a little bit sooner? You probably will. And how much are you going to be willing to compensate for that is kind of up to you. Pablo Hernandez from the PE Factory team, who jumps in Dubai, he can swoop the smallest canopy you can find, and he'll make it look spectacular. And when he chose to start jumping a Horizon, he jumped various sizes. He jumped the 120, he jumped the 150, he jumped the 190, and the one that's in his rig today is a 190 because he didn't see any reason to take one any smaller than that. He loves the way it flies, he loves the way it lands, he can swoop it, and the way he looks at it is he's there looking for excellent opening performance for a wingsuit deployment with a gigantic wingsuit on, with a gigantic wing between his legs and his arms. The bigger the canopy he can get, and the more forgiving canopy he can get, he's going to take it.
Yeah.
So
I got mine right here.
anything on the Horizon stuff you want to add?
The whole thing about the Horizon was that we realized that this is a different generation, probably two generations from the days when people were jumping their 220 square foot Pegasus. Whether they weighed, 200 pounds or 100 pounds, that's what they jumped. And they didn't land that well when they were new, if you look at it through the eyes of current expectations. They landed much better than round parachutes, so what more did they want? When it got old, it didn't flare as well, but it never flared that well to begin with. And we just were good at that, and we had low expectations. That's all gone away. Other than in the base world, you don't really see that at all. So now people, think that a 150 might not be a small canopy, which I think it is. And it's coming down faster, it's going forward faster, and it has to have better flare characteristics. That's how we got to the point where so many people jump at these wing loadings. And they've forgotten the fact that the low permeability fabric does increase in permeability. So the reason why the smaller ones are gonna, quote, not give you good service or not last as long as the larger ones is because they are coming down faster and going forward faster, so they have to do a better job, and you have to do a better job of flaring it. So that's why the larger sizes make sense. The other thing is the intention of that parachute is to allow you to have a big a big parachute as part of the solving of the opening problems. Like Albert said, if you're getting great openings on your Spectre with your wingsuit, great. That thing's gonna last a long time because it'll maintain its zero permeability. But when you decide you're going to buy a new suit and they're not cheap, and then you suddenly have really strange openings because it's a big monster suit, you suddenly find that there's an additional cost of buying that new big suit. You need a better parachute. That's what the Horizon is for. We did do plenty of jumps at full terminal on these things. We did plenty of jumps in small sizes at high wing loadings. We did not do a lot of jumps on the small ones at high wing loadings that were really old. The customers who are good, like the ones Albert mentioned, they do a great job of it, but to me, people who are in that situation should really not loan that parachute with 1,000 jumps to somebody else that they think is a highly competent pilot, because they may have no experience landing an old, worn-out parachute. The other thing is about the fabric itself. There's a variety of different low permeability fabrics. Some of them are low bulk, and some of them are the old conventional F111 type fabric. We've done a lot of testing on our fabric to see how it compares with F111, and we've done side-by-side jumps. Actually, a couple of jumpers did back-to-back jumps between a canopy like the Horizon and then a similar canopy, as similar as we could make it, with normal F111. In every one of those cases, the permeability of our low bulk fabric is better than the best F111 style fabric that we can get in terms of how well it lasts. So I can't speak to other types of fabric, but the fabric that we use, it does have a better permeability lifespan, shall we say. So we're really proud of that canopy, and especially of that fabric. It took a long time to develop it. But you just have to have realistic expectations. Shall we go on to the double stow through a grommet?
Yes.
We are open as a company to doing whatever in the realm of test jumping and finding good results, but then keeping it within the test jumping world for a long time before we're willing to go public with it, because sometimes customers can get pretty creative. It was a long time before we really openly, publicized the double stow. And during that time, there was a packer, I don't know if she was a rigger, out in the West Coast, California, that said that she would never double stow through a grommet because that's a violent act. And to me, the main thing is that the parachute has to stay in sequence, which means the line stows have to come off in the proper sequence. And especially when you've got tuck tab type riser covers and unusual body positions, the last chance to get the risers to come out at the right time is before those locking stows come open. And sometimes that double stow on the locking stows is the only thing that gets the risers to pop open the riser covers. If the person sits up under a canopy coming out of the bag, and the risers are still under the covers, and then they release, whether at the same time or at a different time, it can create really, really hard openings. Line twists and also just hard openings. Think about the way you get the slider down on a canopy. You like pump the rear risers or the toggles. The slider starts coming down when you let up on it, and it comes down really quickly if you pull the riser down and let it go. And so when the risers come out of the riser covers after the canopy's out of the bag, it puts some slack in the lines briefly, and that can really cause the slider to rifle down. So you have this danger of an out of sequence opening, and then you have the risk of a bag lock. We've been packing double stowing through the locking stows through a grommet for probably 15 years, some of us more than that. And any bag lock that I've ever seen has always been a pilot chute problem. And it's something that we know of military groups that do as we recommend. I wasn't aware that the Australians are having a challenge with that.
And UAE as well.
Okay, well, we've written letters to various groups about how we should stow, how we recommend in some parachute systems, depending on what it is, the thickness of the rubber band, the tandem bands, the size of the grommets, that may not be recommendation for everything, but for all the sport systems, there's no reason not to do it. There's only reasons to do it.
As John said, we've been in contact with various militaries on that, and if the UAE or Australia or any other military organization is looking at making a change like that, or there's instructors who have knowledge from the sport side of skydiving who are looking to try and implement a change like that into an organization or military or any type of group that has a bit more stringent regulation as far as what they do, where they're trying to keep things in an orderly fashion and they have protocols. We're happy to work with any of those groups on things like that. And we're happy to provide letters from the manufacturer that state, this is what we recommend for our parachutes. A lot of the times some of the documentation on our website and the different videos can help frame some of that for some of the higher ups, so they can see kind of what we're recommending and why we recommend it. There's actually a video on our website that's on avoiding hard openings, and it's about 15 minutes long, I think. So it's a consumable level for somebody who's maybe not a hardcore skydiver to watch, and it runs through the different reasons as to why you may want to do that double stowing and some other things that can help aid in the packing process, or if there's things that are not in their current SOPs, they can maybe make those adjustments, and we're happy to provide whatever written documentation is needed for that.
Just get with us afterwards.
Yeah.
Get your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Jacob had a question about safety stows.
Yeah. So as far as I'm aware, there's no spec on PA spec or used to be a military spec on the elastic. We don't have one. But the only way I can really say why we don't really support people making them is that in conjunction with the Skydive system, the way it works is the red Skydive lanyard will break at a certain poundage, and that's like the fuse. You want that to break before the safety stow breaks. So if there was a high-speed bag lock, there's a chance the dynamics of the load come down, break the fuse, you go back into a regular sequential deployment, and that's okay. If the force came down to the free bag and hit the safety stow, and it was inadequate, it wasn't very strong, you get bag strip. It's very possible to have bag strip in a container. Then you lose everything to deploy the canopy, but the canopy is on the back of you in the container. Like the magician with the table trip and pulls the cloth off. We can't afford to have that, so that's why we're pretty strict on people not making their own safety stows, because we do reject probably honestly 30% plus of our elastic because it goes out of tolerance, and we check every one 100%. So that's why we're kind of strict on that. And again, there's really no spec on it. And yes, if you're where you are, or Australia or places, it's much easier to make something. I get that, but there's just no support there if that happens, because there is a reason why we're quite firm on that. It's all to do with the deployment sequence of the Skydive in activation. Do you want to add for that?
No, I mean, on our side, we agree completely with what Tom is saying. It's all about down to the testing development, especially when you come to high speed malfunction. And introductions of MARTs have really started putting a little more focus on that, because there's a limit to how much the pilot chute can extract. But when you have MART systems that uses a main canopy out, then we put in some safety features. At least on the skyhook itself, there's a safety feature in the sense of the red lanyard that has a breaking strength to avoid all that, like Tom was saying, load transferring down into that. There may be other MART systems that don't have that, so for those systems, that functionality of the safe stow really, really becomes much more relevant.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
We appreciate the work you guys put into making sure that the safety stow is appropriate for your rigs, and I hope that other rig manufacturers are as diligent.
I think the main difficulty is, for example, in any military, or in Australian military as well, but in UAE currently, because I'm involved with them, we have 4,000 systems from 5 different manufacturers. So, and some of them will send just a roll of the bungees and say, okay guys, this is our specs, you can make it. But we have military javelins as well, and you guys say no, buy from us. The guy up there with the big stars saying, well, if those guys are okay, those guys should be okay as well. So,
Or the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's always easy to
So-
go with the easier solution, the thing that makes things go faster.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of like the problem that we run into sometimes, either with organizations or with ratings that are out there, that people get certain, what's it called, they're allowed to do certain things, and then that starts spanning out. At the end of the day, the ones that have done all the proper testing on that particular system are the manufacturers. And that is why we're very diligent about certain things we will allow people to do, and we trust the fact that they have a certain rating and a certain skill set to earn that rating. But there's some things that we know that all that testing, development, and QC control goes heavily into that. As Tom was saying, testing every single safety standard.
I will definitely appreciate it, any support for the documentation and any feedback from you guys, because it goes to the riggers who have to enforce everything that manufacturer recommends, and sometimes it is difficult.
We have a spec for making safety stoves as part of training as a rigger to make safety stoves. But I would also say that if you want the support of the manufacturer, then you need to follow what they say. So yes, if you've got a Thomas Sports one, fine, make your own safety stove. But really, if it says in the manual you need to do this, then the only way to get the true support is by following what it says in the manual. Whether that's packing or whether that's components. As riggers we make stuff, and the manufacturers may or may not be totally happy with that, but if you want the full support, you really have to follow what's written down in the manual. So.
They're great skill sets to have. Like the safety stove is a perfect example. It's a great skill set to have, especially with container systems where the manufacturers may or may not be around anymore, or they'll allow it. But if you only do one once in a while, you just don't have the almost currency, if you will, to continue to do these up to the specs, but the manufacturers do. At the end of the day, we know that people are all the way around the world, but if you have a high volume of a certain type of container, maybe keep a couple of spares. You know, over the course of a few years, chances are you're going to end up using them anyways.
Yes. No,
we do a lot in the house, obviously, but we still get our safety stoves from top for javelins that come through within our area.
Any other questions? Yes. Send the microphone down. Hang on.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by support, is the one thing at the beginning. Okay, that's loud. You say you need the support if you're going to follow the manual, but obviously a lot of things in the UK, British riggers are taught to manufacture all component parts at different levels. And the aim behind it is so you can actually repair them better if they need repairing, but also you can manufacture replacements if you need to do it. Now, I understand manufacturers wouldn't like anybody, apart from the manufacturers, to make products for their overall components. As a manufacturer, would you say that you don't like people making free bags, but would you be happy for them to make a deployment bag or a pilot chute or a bridle line, or did you limit just certain things that you don't want to be made, and that's why you put that in the manual?
I think the easiest way to answer that question is certificated components, like TSO component, like a free bag, a reserve pilot chute, reserve ripcord handle, or the safety stove. I would say that should be left to the manufacturer, and different countries have different rules. I know in England, if you are equivalent master rigger, you're allowed to make anything at all. I don't quite agree with that, because again, you might just do it once in your career. It doesn't mean you really have the tools, the skills, or the knowledge to understand it. So, speaking as a manufacturer, I think there's some components which we would not want to be put out there because of the quality control and making sure it's made correctly.
Well, I get that from a point of view. For example, if somebody's making risers, I hate to see homemade risers. I really hate it, because I've seen all the tolerances, the small tolerances are going to make a risers. I've seen lots of testing on risers, and I've seen the compatibility mixed up. You use one set of risers on a different rig, it affects it massively. But making a free bag is quite a simple thing to teach somebody. So a free bag pre-loop is a simple thing to teach somebody to do. So from my point of view, it's making risers should be a big no-no, because the tolerances and the risk assessment at the end of it, you make them wrong, you can kill somebody. If you make a set of toggles wrong, you could cause a malfunction or deployment bag or something else. So it's the level of risk varies. So why did you focus just on the free loop? And that's the bit that...
Well, let's just talk about that then. So the safety toe... Yes.
I think what he's saying about support for the manufacturers is, as a equivalent master rigger in the UK, yeah, you can do any and all of the above, and we often have people who come to some part that have to build a whole container in order to get their ticket. So on the support levels, let's say you did go ahead and you did build a free bag, and I'm quite comfortable with your ability to do so. But then there's an issue down the road, okay? So what negates a TSO, right? So your free bag is not TSO, right? So first of all, you're putting a free bag in somebody's container that's getting into an airplane that the pilot should disallow because it's not a TSO product. The second part of it is, if there is an incident or there's a fatality or even someone's broken their leg or whatever, and not so much in the UK, but in America people sue for breathing fresh air, right? So are they going to go after you on that free bag? No. They're going to, Alan doesn't have a cop pissing, right? So I'm going to go after the manufacturer, right? So when I think he's saying about support from the manufacturer, if it's a TSO product and it's from the manufacturer, when there's an incident, we do put our money where our mouth is, and we can support that and help that family or the individual. So it's more of a risk management than it is an ability to do it. Does that make sense?
It does, but from the BPA point of view, are you talking about the support from the BPA or definitely from the manufacturers? My experience of the BPA is at the end of the day, they teach you to manufacture stuff, but then say, oh no, you're responsible, we're not. And that's, it negates what we teach you to do in the first place.
Well, sometimes it can come across as if we don't, us as manufacturers, don't want you to do anything at all. And that's actually not accurate, but there are certain specifics where the materials, or the construction materials and the specs are so strict, they have such a big impact on it, and as Tom was saying, the materials and safety tools can have a huge effect on that. Total elongation, strength, construction, all these things matter. When it comes down to a harness, for instance, for us, we don't really allow you to manufacture your own safety stoves, but we will allow you to rebuild a harness as long as it goes with the manufacturer's specs, because the materials that you get are easily sourced as well. You're making sure that you get the same ones, and you can replicate it as a master rigger. It's one of the parts of the skill set you get, and it's fairly easy to see and measure, etc., and you can do a sizing change. But there are some parts that we don't want you to start changing or making yourself or creating, and others that we want. And Mainrise is a good example where we published specs to help, because we know that those are being manufactured by lofts, so we want to help as much as we can. So they're actually published as a company, not only as specs alone, but also an instruction on how to build them to help and support as much as possible. But there are some things where we're not entitled to, we're not required to give you the specs, because either it's proprietary information or it's part of the testing where we just foresee issues with it if we just let it go freely. And as Pat is saying, lawsuits are very, very, very real. There's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that people may not see, but the industry works as a whole to defend the industry from all these lawsuits and things that come along.
So for one final question, thank you for that, totally makes sense, I 100% agree. One final question then is, as manufacturers, would you be happy with somebody else making your risers to go onto your containers?
I mean, people do already, and if they're competent and that's what they do as a living, that's great. But normally the people who make we call it the people who work in the garages and stuff, they just see one part of the process and don't really understand the big picture sometimes. So they focus on that, which is sometimes detrimental to the end user and the system. And again, if that riser fails, you don't hear Billy Bob's riser failed, you hear some past risers failed if it's on a javelin. So again, it's really about the ability of the rigger himself. I've seen some actually risers from Gary recently. That's in our shop last week actually, which were fantastic. But again, they look at one part of it, maybe not all of it. People who make pilot sheets look at one part of it, not the whole deployment. So I wouldn't say they shouldn't do it. I think they should do it with education and understand the bigger, wider picture and get support if they need it. I just want to go back to the safety stow with the master riggers and equivalent. It's not about the ability to sew it. You know, we sew them every day, but we reject a lot of our elastic because it doesn't meet the grade we want. And the spools it comes in are quite big, and because of the way it's wound and tight, and it changes between a batch of 10. So it's not about ability, it's about controlling the product itself, and that's why we're quite strict on that.
The safety stow is expected to do, as you guys know, quite a thing to allow the parachute to deploy quickly and safely at low airspeeds, but also to deal with very high-speed deployments as well. And we've got types of skydiving now where people go faster than the equipment is even certified for. I want you to think about the idea of how the equipment gets certified for the airspeeds that they're certified for. We go a little faster and a little heavier with dummies, which are very brutal. It's a very strict test, but how many do we do? Do we do 1,000 deployments above max speed? Do we do 100? The strength test, there's 3 that need to be done. That's it. So anytime you go faster, you are depending upon companies like ours trying to outfox our weaknesses to make them work well in spite of variances in material, in spite of a lot of different things, in spite of rigging methods, in spite of perhaps parachutes that aren't quite sized properly for the container, all kinds of stuff, bad body position. And the free stow, well, okay, I'll say it. About 20 years ago, we were doing some very expensive testing on some military parachutes that were designed to go very quick. And we hired a B-25 bomber. We were going really fast. It was really exciting, and we blew everything apart. And in looking at the video, I wish we had more than 30 frames a second back then, but we could definitely see signs that our deployment system was completely failing us. And then through more digging, we found that one of our riggers had been making the safety stows with a roll of stuff that looked about the same, master rigger, and the elasticity of those safety stows was a little bit different. And basically we had about $30,000 worth of testing in terms of just the cost of the airplane and the day at the drop zone go to waste. And we scratched our head for a long time on that, so we don't do it that way anymore. We go to the people who build the rigs that we test out of, and I don't mind that it's a pain in the neck. Maybe I just have to go across the street or talk to SunPath, but we want our stuff to work properly, and I also believe that's the case with the free bags, with the main deployment bags as well. There's very, very subtle things that we've looked at that I'm not really comfortable speaking about because I'm a user of those items. I have theories, we work with them all the time on very subtle differences in the way deployment bags and stowing devices are made or used that I think make a difference. I might be wrong, but I believe they make a difference, and I want those guys to build my free bag. I don't want to build a copy of it. We built some and designed some free bags for very high-speed military stuff. We've done it in conjunction with a lot of work from these guys, co-creating those things so that they work very, very well. And I just don't think it really makes sense not to just call these guys and ask them to put a free stow, a safety stow in an envelope and pop it over here and have spares. It just doesn't make sense to me, especially for the reasons that Pat was talking about.
Can I ask Pete a final question then, please? Because obviously my initial question was based on the BPA system more than anything, and I want to know what the manufacturers say. Because, Pete, as you know, in the BPA, you promote don't make the free bag free loops, which is great because the manufacturers don't do it. But you're quite happy for people to make risers as low experience parachute riggers. Parachute riggers can be very low experience, but you're happy for the BPA to make risers. My concern is how can we be happy teaching someone to make something quite complicated and then get them to qualify them when they've had very little examination on making those risers as well, and when they qualify they can go out, they can make them anytime they want. Yet we have a lot of pressure on don't use the wrong free loop. To me, the two systems don't seem compatible. So that's why I brought the question up in the first place. A lot of effort on a free loop, but really no concern on making risers. That's where I lose the logic.
Yeah, I think the thing that we've moved with risers in the training centres, for those of you not riggers, for being parachute rigger, you have to make a set of big ring risers to the UPT 98 spec. because that has very close tolerances on it, and if we didn't have that spec, I think we would have got rid of it as a thing a long time ago. I think the difference for me that I've absorbed is basically when we're making risers, we have the spec and the materials are available to those specs. When we're copying a deployment bag, we have the materials, you can recognise them, and the military spec materials, you can copy that. Where we move away from those military spec items, I think that's when it gets difficult, because you're then looking at, well, what's the equivalent? So while we've used Type 7, Type 8, etc., I think that's something that's controllable. And I do take on the point that with the bungee, which doesn't have a spec, what are the tolerances? Generally, I want to talk to you guys about what are the tolerances on making other things like bridles and pilot chutes and things that your companies work to, because that would be interesting. But for me, I think it's that when we make something as riggers, it should be the equivalent, made to the same standard. So when we reharness something, we're using the same webbing and the same stitch pattern and the same thread, or the same quality of thread, as the manufacturer did. Where it's not something that we can calculate and replicate, then I think that enters into a different area. So making the exact copy is really what we've done. And for those of you, yes, we are talking about risers and other bits and pieces in the syllabus as to whether they really need to be there. So, any other questions?
Yeah, I got one. Sorry for everybody else if it just sounds like a riggers chat, but so what Pete was saying, just regarding the materials, riggers up to a certain level have to build pretty much to a manufacturer's spec. We're not allowed to get creative. Just as a question for you, if you could just go into how your companies choose the material, a little bit of how they test it and why it's done so. You know, kind of why can't I go on eBay and just buy the cheapest thing out there?
Okay, so all our materials, Pat could probably tell you a lot better than me, but and join in please if you want to. But all our materials coming from our suppliers. We normally have 2 or 3 different suppliers. That way, if one goes belly up, we keep going, we build rigs. But they all meet the a specification which we have in-house. So we test every product that comes in before it goes into what we call the cage. And then we pay for the certification from the manufacturer of the products, let's say Type 7 webbing. We pay for those certs so we can actually do a double check against what we've learned in the testing phase, and then put it with the purchase order with that material that came in. So that's how we have traceability and how we actually check the manufacturer has given us what we need as far as requirements and standards. Does that answer your question?
It does for yourself and for Kenneth and the other guys.
They don't have standards.
We do, they're just lower than Tom's.
Yeah.
No, we follow the same thing. Everything that comes into house gets tested in-house. Work very, very diligently with the sub-suppliers. If there are any issues or any concerns as such, then we'll put a hold onto it until we get within the specs that are set forth. And that comes through a long, long time of manufacturing and testing, of course. It also comes to that those particular materials that have those specs, those tolerances, those strength ratings, etc., are being used to construct and test the systems for the certification. So we have to adhere to that. We have to follow that and continue to follow that. So if you just want to have somebody grab some random webbing and start using that, or change the construction method, it hasn't been tested with that. You're saying, if I wish to go out and use whatever I want to use to build a harness, so you can do that as a manufacturer and create your own testing and approvals, etc. But that's a very costly process to get an approval for your system, just to, let's say you build a container for yourself and your friends. But that's what essentially what the manufacturers do. It's all the work prior to that sets forth the specs that are required for these components of the system.
So we had a customer last year had his own fabric supplemented with his own design in Taiwan. So we required that company to actually meet and match our specs, and it was a lot of paperwork, a lot of effort, but we would not put his material, and he brought yards of it, I mean a bulk, to get the minimum order. We would not use it until we could be satisfied with the certification from the company that manufactured it, and once it matched and equaled ours, we could actually then implement it and put it on the rig. But it's not very common. I don't suggest you guys go and design your own fabric, it's expensive. but which is not worth it. But we do have a standard to follow, and we won't change that.
For us, it's a little different because a lot of our materials are very lightweight. You know, parachute fabric. I don't even remember what the specific specs are on all the materials we use, but in some cases the actual strength of the material that comes in, whether it be tear strength or tensile strength, is quite a bit higher than the minimum spec. So you may get something from somebody that claims that material meets the specification, but if you don't have the actual test results in front of you, you don't know really where it is. There's quite a bit of variance between the maximum and minimum, say on permeability or on strength or on elasticity, these types of things. And those variations do change the performance. They can change the performance of the equipment. And so we're really, really diligent on choosing our manufacturers. There's a lot of companies that think of us as like they hit the mother lode if they can get our fabric business. We buy lots and lots of fabric. And then we sit down at a table and we talk about different things. And at a certain point, they question whether they really want to do business with us, because they very often get questions from us and they don't really know, because the person might be more of a salesperson rather than a technical person. Before you know it, the technical people are there. And we go through a lot of different, very, very interesting discussions about the fabric. And we do our own testing, not just on every lot, but every roll in every lot. And we occasionally see some pretty strange things on fabric that's sold as first quality by the very best manufacturers we can find. And I find it a bit disturbing when I see some of the fabric out there from some, especially like second tier suppliers, where if it looks like F111, you know, and of course that's a trade name that hasn't formally been used for 20, 30 years. If it looks like it, they're good to go with it. And if the person who sold it to them said it was first quality, then they say it's first quality to you guys. And it concerns me. It really concerns me. On the rigs, Type 7 and Type 8, you know, mil spec, you get some certs from your supplier. It's probably not as bad, but they may differ with me on that. That's why I trust them on the materials of that type.
I've got a couple more points to make on a TSO product. We are heavily governed by the FAA, and everything that we purchase or supply has to have traceability. And I mean everything. Just like some things you wouldn't think you'd have to have traceability on a zipper, but you do. And so all the documentation that's kept within our companies means that from rig number 1 to rig number 60,000, at any given moment, an FAA officer could come in, they could pull any random rig, and you have to have traceability on all of that stuff, even if that rig is no longer in service. You know, it could have been cut up and binned, but they can still come back. So if there is an issue with RSL or something, and we have to have a recall, and it's happened, we've all had recalls because it's bad to have bad stuff out there. When you as a rigger get your supplies from Paragear or Square One or Tom Sports or wherever you're getting it, like John says, you don't really know what you're getting. So like on Type 7, Type 8, we're kind of guaranteed to get the best, but even we don't get the best. So even though we might have to buy 20,000 yards of Type 7 and Type 8, sometimes it passes all the tests, and the pull tests, and it's great, and we've got all the certs, and then you start running it, and you start sewing on it, and that black Type 8 is now turning green, because they've re-dyed it, and they think they can pull that over on us. What you're going to see in your lofts is you are going to get that stuff that could have been dyed 2 or 3 times, and it's not going to show up until it's out there in the field for a couple of 100 jumps. And then the first thing they do is they come back to us and they go, what's wrong with this? So we don't know if it's the original harness, because there's nowhere on a packing data card or whatever that you're saying this rigger did this. So now it's back on us again. And I will guarantee you, and PD would probably say the same thing, we reject an awful lot, a lot of hardware especially, and we see that same hardware showing up on another rig because someone else doesn't have that same testing. So I think as riggers, you can do whatever you want to your ability or whatever your certificate says you can, but do you really have the be-alls to be able to back it up and support what you've got? So,
If you don't mind, it just remind me of one part of your question that I didn't really get. We do tensile tests, tear tests. We look at the construction. We look at the thickness. We look at the weight. We look at the finish on the 0P stuff. We watch very carefully for any indications that the formulation of the coating has changed, and we're heavily involved in what that formulation is, very heavily involved. We look for things that may indicate that one of our suppliers may have had a change in something they're getting. If we notice a characteristic difference, we don't just test for not only the minimum standards, but our standards might be different. And we will look for variations on what we're getting from their process, even if it's within the standard, the formal standard. We really watch that stuff because we know it makes a difference. We've actually, in the old days, the low permeability fabric used to have a permeability of between 0 and 3 CFM on the spec. Well, I could build a parachute for you out of 3 CFM and 0 CFM, the same parachute, and you would swear as a jumper that they're completely different models. They open, fly, and land different. And we actually are very concerned about the permeability being too low on some of the parachutes that we build. We watch that like a hawk. And we also do UV testing. And the method that we use, we actually changed to a method, I forget the proper term. There's carbon arc and the other one, I forget which one is which right now. Can only keep so much up here. But we went to that method of testing. We bought our own machine to do that several years before the industry eventually, the fabric industry said, yeah, that's the better way, and then they changed. And we did that through our collaboration. So again, I'm not trying to say that we can't make a mistake or whatever, but we feel a responsibility to control that, and it's very difficult when fully capable riggers do their best and something doesn't go well. Let's say it's on one of their components that was replaced or replicated to the best of their ability, and there might have been something that worked properly until you get to the fringes of the performance envelope, and you add a little instability. If a parachute opens hard enough that there's actually damage sustained on the parachute, of course it bothers us, but nobody says, hey, that safety sew sure made that parachute open hard. The evidence is often destroyed, and we may not know why, so we do our best to control that. And I think we rely on the riggers to make good decisions on that stuff.
Just while I got one last question. So at the top of my risers made by container manufacturers, I end up with slinks that then will turn into what would be my canopy manufacturers. And that goes on all the way up through the canopy to the bridle, which is my container manufacturers, and then to the pilot chute that is obviously made by the container manufacturers as well. Just wondering how your two separate companies, or three even, are interlinked in pretty big ways, and just how you guys all work together to resolve a problem that may originate somewhere else. So a bad opening canopy, as you said yourself earlier on, John, is maybe down to a poor pilot chute, which is a separate entity almost.
Nobody says to us, nobody after a hard opening says, man, my vector really slammed the heck out of me, and it might even have non-standard components in it. It's always the parachute. So sometimes maybe I'm a little overly sensitive to that kind of thing. But the thing is that Our company does that through a lot of collaboration with rig manufacturers. We do it with several rig manufacturers, but in particular these two, because they're so popular, they've been around, and we've worked with them for a long time. You know, especially when you guys were in Sea Hills, that started us pretty heavily with that. And of course, UPT has always been, you know, not always, but since the early 70s, they've been in DeLand where we've been. So we always, on a regular basis, work together, the three companies, and we sometimes work with other manufacturers as well. As far as the way you put it, it's interesting to me, having started jumping in the 70s. In those days, when you bought a parachute, a canopy, it came complete with risers and deployment bag, and often with a pilot chute. And we can thank Mr. Booth for not having to build those components anymore, because he invented a funny set of risers called 3-ring risers, and this funny weird thing called a hand-deployed pilot chute with Velcro to go across certain places to get it somewhere. So now we just build a parachute. And of course those components do affect how things work. That's why we work together so much. And then also we work together in the industry, in the PIA technical committees, rigging committees, to make sense of all that stuff. I think that if you look at what most skydivers think about the relationships between manufacturers, especially competing manufacturers, particularly parachute manufacturers, they always want to like put us in a corner and say, you know, like provoke us and have us come out swinging, but it's not like that with us normally. The people who build parachutes, many of those people are good friends of mine, and I think the same thing could be said about the rig manufacturers. Bill Booth from UPT lives right next door to another rig manufacturer, Jump Shack. Their kids used to play together, you know, and so we all collectively as an industry, manufacturing industry, we want to do the very best thing. There's a lot more collaboration and sharing than some people might think.
I've got a question on deployment and pilot chutes and the size and type of pilot chute. So as a canopy manufacturer and as container manufacturers, some of you have issued guidance on the relevant sizes of pilot chutes and things. So how does that kind of work on the container side? Do you have different size pilot chutes with different size containers, for instance?
Okay, so we use F111. We don't use 0P. That's part of the question, really, because people don't take care of their equipment in general. I mean, they quite happily buy nice things for their car, but they won't replace a VOC pocket on their rig when it's needed. So with the 0P pilot chute, we found that could prematurely deploy in a sit-flying situation or a free-flying situation. And I've personally repaired 2 rigs at drop zones when they were sit-flying and they had a premature deployment, and a reserve container got ripped off by the main risers. So we don't go down that road because possibly of that. We have made them, but very, very few. The size, as far as deployment, it's a time thing. We use we video the deployments, and there's a window of a perfect opening or a too faster opening, so the pilot chute's too big, or it's too slow, the pilot chute's not correctly calibrated, or it's too small. So we have tools we use there to actually offset the weight of the canopy to the size of the pilot chute, which we use. To go back on some of the collaboration, especially with PD, I remember speaking to John, I pretty much call Albert every other week. But like we developed the bag, the 3-stow bag for the deployment system, and we spoke about not going larger than 150 square foot parachute, which we listen to what they say, because they're the manufacturers of canopies, and they know a lot more than us. So that's another example of the collaboration there. People wonder why they can't get a 3-stow bag for a 190. It's because PD suggests we don't do it, and it doesn't make sense for us to do that. So that's just an example of that. Does that answer your question there for the pilot chutes? Or do you want to pick up?
We as a manufacturer offer both CP and F111, and we can advise on what we believe are the ups and downs in both. Sometimes it comes down to personal preference. F111 doesn't last as long as CP. CP has a little bit more of a, maybe what people call a snatch force on the extraction as F111. There's hop and pops involved or free fall involved. There's a slippery fabric versus less slippery fabric. And we focus a lot on creating a deployment system and a BOC system that doesn't allow the pilot chute to come out even if it's very slippery, so you can benefit from the long-term life of, for instance, CP. There may be some size considerations to have into play. We talk with performance designers a lot because they've done a lot of testing on canopies, so they have a lot of good feedback on sizing on pilot chutes, for instance. So we try and bring that in, but it's on the constant evaluation. Canopies and containers change and evolve as well. So what used to be utilized 15, 20 years ago may not fit as well into today's jumping in terms of the size of the pilot chute. You might have smaller canopies, bigger canopies. You might have tighter containers, looser containers. So we try and kind of work the broad range in that, and also listen to the jumpers in the end, what they prefer and what they wish to have out of their product and what type of jumping they do.
On our side, we've used a lot of different pilot chutes over the years. The majority of what we currently use and have been using for the last few years and use on all of our testing equipment is usually a 28 or 30 inch F111 type pilot chute. The biggest thing with those that we usually find is they usually provide a smooth, clean extraction, and it's also something that, again, people don't like to always maintain their gear. It is something that wears out over time. So it is important that the jumpers are keeping an eye on that and the condition of it. What kind of condition is the mesh in? What kind of condition is the material in? And it is something that, like a lot of other parts that people don't consider replacing, like slinks, risers, it's something that wears out over time that eventually, when it reaches a certain point, it's time to throw it, it's time to cut it up and throw it away, not give it to someone else of lower experience who needs one and doesn't want to pay for it. Get rid of it, it's old, it's used up, and replace it. So that's primarily what we use. We haven't really had much trouble with any pilot chute related issues on our testing.
So that's all really great information, but one of the things that a rigger's got to do is when he gets a customer to replace their pilot chute, it's good advice to say swap like for like. If you've got an F111, you put an F111 on. If it's got that size for that canopy and they've been using it, it's quite easy. But when you get a rig that hasn't got a pilot chute and you've got to put one on because it's got lost in a cutaway, etc., etc. And somebody said, what size pilot chute should I have? What material should I have? And it depends on a lot of things. The size of the pilot chute, the material, the bridle line length, the size of the canopy, the type of skydiving they're doing. It's a very complex issue when you add everything into it. And when a rigger turns around to me, he says, how do you advise them to advise their customers? It's actually quite difficult to do. So, I mean, I understand what one of Peter's questions is there an easy way around this? That you recommend as a manufacturer, saying if you've got a 150, should you have this size? If you've got a 210, should you have this size or this type of deployment? Because if you've got a stiletto opening nice and slow, or if you've got a crew canopy nice and fast, all these things bring together make it a really complicated subject when you look at the big picture. So is there an easy way to advise riggers to advise their customers?
To me, the main thing is to stick with something that is fairly general and works in most situations, which is why we recommend the 28 to 30 inch F111 pilot chute. For a long time I was an advocate of the 0P pilot chutes. I got away from that about 20 years ago. It was mainly during the time when I was very current with like lots and lots of test jumps, 500-600 a year, when I was making changes of pilot chute, and because we're switching from this rig to that rig and this parachute and that rig, and occasionally I saw a difference in the deployments that I traced to the pilot chute. And at one point it was the way I was throwing the pilot chute. You might think that sounds really crazy, but to me the 0P pilot chute has a quicker inflation and a quicker snatch, and sometimes when you start going a little bit fast, depending on the line stow method and everything, things start to get out of control, particularly with some parachutes that are more finicky with airspeed. And with the 0P pilot chute, I found that they worked better when they were smaller, but then they became more sensitive to how they're thrown and how the lines are stowed and your airspeed. And eventually I just said, I don't want it. That's a personal decision, that I don't want a 0P pilot chute. And then when we start looking at what we should recommend, we have to respect that different rig manufacturers have different opinions on it. It is their component, so we do our best to influence. We're not going to dictate to them. And when we come up with our best choice and we actually are willing to speak about it, time goes on. People start using or decide not to use our recommendations. We learn. The customers get sometimes very creative in ways we never would have expected. And it's our willingness to be open to things that helps things change and improve. And in order to do that, we have to entertain that there's something that we don't quite fully understand the whole way. If we think we know everything, then might as well, we're done, you know? It stops right there, and that may not be a good thing. So we try to be open to it. But what we found is this 28 to 30 seems to be very forgiving. We use that on pretty much all sizes of canopy up to near student size, and also at many different altitudes. There are variables, but one of them is just how the pilot chute's constructed. You know, different mesh can make a huge difference on how the pilot chute works. And so it is complicated, and we cannot make a complicated recommendation. We've got to make one that will work generally well for most people on the side of pilot chutes.
I believe on our website and on our manual online, if you go to the canopy compatibility chart, at the right-hand side of that, so per size of container will be an equivalent or diameter for the main pilot chute. So there's a guide there you can reference to quite easily. But they are quite complicated. Calibration is important, and that can mess things up quite easily as far as longevity for the pilot chute and the bridle itself.
So one of the benefits about having people come and ask you for this is that you can look at their experience level as well. If people are fairly inexperienced, they're looking for fairly generalized gear. That's where those recommendations come in, the overall standard. But when you get into the more specialized areas, you get into wingsuiting, canopy piloting, crew, all these things, you tend to have a source of information either from the groups that you jump with or your own personal experience. And that's what we talk about when people have personal preferences. Once you get a certain amount of experience, people tend to go, I like this, or I tried this for a long time, like Joe was saying, and then I went over to this. Me personally, I jump a CP for my regular free fall, and then when I do CP, so hop and pops, sometimes out of Cessnas with lower airspeed, I want a little more surface area, so I have a larger F-111 pilot chute, and that's my personal preference for the type of jumping that I do. And that's come over time as well. So sometimes it's actually really good to try and either figure out where people are coming from or kind of figure out their experience level. And if nobody has a clue or there's nobody to draw it from, then start in that generalized area that really works. And if they want an answer, then maybe even borrow one to try it out, because you get two people that are doing the same with the same amount of jumps, they may not have the same kind of preference on the feel for it. It is one of those interesting areas where we have so much information in terms of sizing, canopy types, etc., harness and container systems. But that's one of the areas we get asked about all the time, and there's so many different opinions and preferences on it, primarily from the jumpers. So we try and kind of cater to that and try and advise as much as we can within that without getting too specific on it, because it can be maybe not exactly what that person is looking for. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Any other questions?
I've got one, probably quite a simple one for you, actually. I try not to be too long. If you're recommended or you're testing fabrics and harness material and stuff like that, is it more recommended that we come to the manufacturer to source material from rather than a generic like Paragear to get almost all our materials?
We're happy to work with riggers who need, if you need fabric for patches or anything like that, we handle requests like that all the time. We actually sell scrap bags for riggers who need material for patching. We sell it, I think it's by the pound. And it's larger pieces of scrap. So I'm not talking about like little 5 centimeter strip. It's patches large enough, pieces of fabric large enough to do a large patch, and it'll come in have various sizes in there. And if you need a specific color,
just ask and we'll make sure there's some of it in there for you. So that way you are getting material that went through our quality control inspection. It made it onto the factory floor, was probably part of what was on our laser table that did not get used. So we allow that to be continued use. Same thing with lines. We have riggers who call us who, if they're not ordering a complete manufactured line set, they'll purchase foot, and we sell foot by the roll. So that has gone through the QC inspection as well. And then you're getting the same stuff as what is on there. We don't necessarily say don't buy it from somewhere else, but if you do choose to buy something from somewhere else, like we had talked about earlier, there's a bit of a variable in there. Is it the same type of fabric as what's on there? Just because it's in the spec, does it actually meet the spec that we have as a manufacturer? So you definitely have a little bit of a variable there, and it's something you've got to weigh as a rigger as to whether or not you're willing to be open to that, or is it something you think is cut and dry that you can absorb that responsibility on. We do have people who come back to our maintenance department, or they come to us in the marketing department and they have some sort of issue, and one of the first things we look at is what's on their system, and is it all set up the way it originally was when the container came from the container manufacturer, when the canopy came from the canopy manufacturer, what components have been changed, and what is different. So we run into people who change sliders, we run into people who make repairs on their canopy, or they do different things with their line set, and they inadvertently change brake settings, they change components from the component manufacturer, they redo risers, they change deployment bags and the way the stows are set up, they do weird things with pilot chutes. And one of the first things in diagnosing an issue that a customer may be having is we look at what components they put on there or what they've changed and how it may have changed from the way it was originally engineered from the container side and from the canopy side to identify any potential variables there might be. Because obviously if someone's put on a field manufactured line set, that's a pretty big variable that very well could be affecting the way that canopy opens, flies, and lands. So if you want to keep those variables reduced as much as possible, then sourcing that material from us as the fabric manufacturer or from the container manufacturers may be advisable.
So we find in repairs, we get orders quite a lot to replace harnesses around the world. So what Pat said earlier about traceability, if you get material from us, the benefit would be that we're going to prep, we're going to mark, we're going to do some things to the webbing before you get it. So all you do is an install, sew 4 junctions, and you've replaced a harness. And then you've got the support and the paperwork trail of what we can provide for that. There's a difference between Class 1 and Class 1A webbing. Some people don't look for that, but there's a reason why we do and don't use it. They're both as strong as each other. Again, it might be an oversight if you buy something off Amazon or something like that. So most riggers around the world actually prefer us to mark, cut, even prep the webbing. So it's very limited when they get it to what they have to do. It's the final install, which I think is beneficial. It's easier. At the same time, we're happy to send sterilized drawings as far as details for stitch patterns and anything like that. Again, don't make things up as you go along. It's not the best way to go, but it's quite common for us to actually send out materials ready for the install by the riggers who are approved to do it.
It's basically the same on us. If you get it from us, we can provide you with a lot number that goes into that shows that it's been tested as well, and you have some sort of traceability on it as well. If you then encounter any sort of small issues with it, then we can trace it back through our system as well. So getting materials when possible from the manufacturers within the reasons that they'll allow is definitely beneficial. But the key thing is to have traceability. As any type of rigger out there, any type of master rigger out there, to ensure that traceability, so you can always pull out the paperwork and always follow the trail back.
That's fantastic, thank you. Just from a military point of view, we're kind of more accountable when we make a repair than maybe because we answer to the BPA and the military. So my final question is we jump a lot of logo canopy, so more relevant to the PD boys. Do you have any sort of hard line or sort of evidence on the lifespan of a logo canopy as opposed to a straight manufactured one?
When you say a logo canopy, do you mean one where we assemble the canopy with the artwork on it? Okay, we do it in a way that minimizes any change in the opening flight or landing characteristics, but it does have an effect, and it depends on which model, which size, what the components are, how the person packs, how they use the parachute. We do our best to eliminate those sorts of things. I did want to talk a little bit more about the fabric thing just briefly before I forget. Pat suggested to you that we reject a lot of fabric. It's usually hundreds of thousands of dollars a year of fabric that we send back, and that's the stuff that we don't want to use, that is, by the industry, first quality. Now, I'm sure that there might be some mistakes sometimes. We feel sometimes that we've received fabric that we've previously rejected. Don't know if that's an honest mistake or an intention. I get the feeling that there is kind of a grapevine that lets the many of the material manufacturers know who is very diligent on their self-inspection of the materials they receive and who isn't. And we talk to one another, the parachute manufacturers. When we start finding challenges with what we're receiving in the door, sometimes we'll call some of the other manufacturers and see if they're seeing the same problems. And very often the more diligent parachute manufacturers will say, yeah, we're seeing the same thing. Several years ago, it was much worse. 25 years ago, it was much worse. And one of the parachute manufacturers wanted us to do some sort of a day-glow pen. This is no good, rejected by PD across the fabric, so that other manufacturers could check with a black light. We never went to that point, but we're trying to all raise the bar on what we get, because the demands that we place on and you place on the performance of your parachute require that. It's really quite amazing that this stuff even works at all, to be honest.
If you order a roll of line from PD, though, bear in mind that their small roll isn't very small, especially on the small stuff. Any other questions? Yeah.
One other thing that we that's a little bit more current that we're running into a bit more is on some of the smaller lines that folks are doing out in the field. And it relates to stuff that's 300 or 200 size on some of our competition canopies. And also you see the 300 line on the outboard lines on the Valkyrie. So more recently, or initially when that really, really small line came out, we requested that all of those relines be done in our factory, understanding that it's pretty tricky line to work with, and missing a bar tack on it's pretty easy to do. Obviously, if we miss a bar tack or misplace a bar tack, we just take the line and we toss it in the bin and we go cut a new one and put it on. If someone does that in the field, it's pretty difficult for them to just simply throw it away and grab another one unless they've got that type of line in their loft. More recently, we've opened up the doors a little bit on that to allow folks in the field to do those types of relines, assuming they have the machines that they're capable of doing that work, and they have the skill level and currency to do that type of work. So we do have folks in the field that do that, and it is something that's an option. We've also put together work instructions for those small lines for folks that don't necessarily want to bar tack them, but want to straight stitch them instead. So we did some work in our engineering department to figure out what that straight stitch should look like and what type of thread should be used, et cetera, et cetera. So if you find yourself in a position where you have a good chunk of customers who have those types of canopies and want you to do that kind of work, those work instructions are on the website. If you have questions on it, you can always give us a call too, and we can help step you through it. If you find that there's enough of that work for you to do and you feel comfortable doing it. a lot of people, not that we try and talk people out of it, but a lot of people, once they call us and we explain the process to them, and they look at the line, they look at it and go, yeah, I don't want to do that. Because they realize if they make a mistake with that line, they're potentially going to destroy the line, and then any cost and time saving to their customer is probably lost. Potentially any profit is also going to be lost as well, because then they're going to have to order a new line from us in Florida, and by the time they get it shipped to wherever they are, they've eaten up a lot of time and a lot of money, so sometimes they choose not to do it. But for those of you who, as I said, have the machines to do it, you feel competent and comfortable in doing it, and the currency also really helps with that stuff. If you're working with that small line on a regular basis, then you're going to get competent with it. You're going to get a lot more comfortable with it, and you'll potentially feel really good doing it. If you're only touching one of those line sets once or twice a year, I'd probably recommend not messing with it. But if you're somebody who's doing it, the folks in our maintenance department that we have doing it, they're touching that line every day or every other day if it's slow. So they're used to working with it. Our machines are set up with a special custom-made foot to hold that line, so we don't misplace the bar tack very often at all. So that's something that you guys should be aware of if you do run into that in the field. You'll probably start seeing that a bit more out there because you can order the line sets from us and do them in the field, and you may get more requests for that from your customers.
Well, thank you very much for your contributions.
Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.